Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience. To begin, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. Today we meet on the land of the Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri and Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay our respects to elders across this land. We note that sovereignty has never been ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This makes the dispossession and the theft of this land and what is now so-called Australia from Aboriginal peoples an act of extreme cultural violence. Again, good morning, everyone. My name is Annie Madden, and I'm the Executive Director of Harm Reduction Australia. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to the first major plenary of HR23. It has, of course, taken an extraordinary amount of work and effort to get us, all of us, here in this room, in the Naarm lands of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And when I say it has taken a great deal of work and effort, I don't just mean the conference organisers, although that is absolutely part of what I am talking about. But I'm also referring to the extraordinary amount of work and coordination that it takes for some people to come to this part of the world and, depending on your home country situation, to be free to leave, to travel, to raise the funds, to get the visas, to navigate border control. The list is long. So I want to say welcome, and I hope this is an enriching and rewarding conference for each and every one of you. And toward that end, we have, to kick things off today, we have, as we say in Australia, a cracker of a first plenary. As Naomi stated at the conference opening, we cannot fight racism and other forms of oppression without fundamentally reforming current punitive drug policies. But you might ask, why is this the case? It is the case because the current prohibitionist approach is inherently racist, both in its historical intent and its contemporary and relentless application. It is expressed in the way that Black, First Nation and people of colour communities globally are disproportionately incarcerated for drug-related offences, in the fact that in Australia, Aboriginal people make up approximately 2% of the general population, but over 30% of the prison population, and are 10 times more likely to be incarcerated for drug-related offences. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, Maori make up 60% of those incarcerated for drug-related offences. And in the US, African Americans represent 80 to 90% of all people sent to prison on drug-related charges. And that is just a small example of how the racist intent of current drug prohibitionist policies are expressed and applied every day. So again, the list is long. There is no doubt that the war on drugs is a racist proposition. But what do we do? Well, today I have 4 incredible speakers to help kickstart the conversation. I will introduce each of our speakers in more detail soon, but for now I'm very excited to say that we will be hearing first from Kirsten Hahn, second, Gina Jackson, third, Kassandra Frederique, and we may have Gideon Lasco speaking later. And they will speak to us on the theme of challenging systems of oppression. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Kirsten Hahn. Thank you. Kirsten Hahn is a member of the Transformative Justice Collective, which aims to demystify Singapore's legal punishment system, build alternatives to coercive and punitive systems, and work towards transformative justice. She has been an anti-death penalty activist in Singapore since 2010. As an independent journalist, she runs the We the Citizens newsletter. She also writes extensively about capital punishment and other human rights issues in Singapore. Please make Kirsten welcome.
Good morning, and thank you all for inviting me here today. My name is Kirsten Han. I'm a member of the Transformative Justice Collective in Singapore, and I've been an anti-death penalty activist for about 13 years. And today I'm here to talk about oppression. And simply put, oppression is about power. The power to dictate, to control, to coerce, and the power to make decisions. The power to decide who is worthy of respect, worthy of favor, and worthy of life. In Singapore, we are nominally free, but realistically restrained, restricted, and repressed. And we're familiar with the ways in which a person might be deemed worthy or deserving, whether it's to attend a good school, to be eligible for financial assistance, or to buy a public housing flat with full government subsidy. But no one is more familiar with how merciless the system in Singapore can be than the prisoners on death row. They're the people that Singapore has decided do not deserve to live. There are currently about 55 people on death row in Singapore, a small country of about 5.5 million people, and the overwhelming majority were convicted of non-violent drug offenses and given the mandatory death penalty. The majority of them are also from ethnic minority communities, so they are the most marginalized and vulnerable. The dominant narrative in my country casts these people as villains whose lives have to be forfeit to keep everyone else safe. The Singapore government is so proud of this position that they describe our drug policies of incarceration and execution as part of a harm prevention strategy, which they tell us is better than harm reduction. Part of oppression is also the power to be the loudest voice. It is easy in Singapore to find out what the government thinks because it's all over the mainstream media. They'll tell you in PR campaigns that they've paid with taxpayer money, and in interviews with obliging journalists and social media influencers. What we hear much less of are the voices of those that these powerful people have decided do not deserve to live. And so what I would like to do today in this speech is to share some of these voices with you. Before they take your life, they will try to take everything else they can from you: your freedom, dignity, rights, dreams, hope, value, and respect. Everything, like a vacuum cleaner, sucked away before our lives are ended. These are the words of Paneerselvam Prantaman, who has been on death row since 2017. He was convicted of trafficking about 51 grams of heroin. The court recognized that he had merely been a drug mule, but still had to sentence him to death because the prosecution refused to issue him something we call a certificate of cooperation. Under Singapore's laws, drug mules can only be spared the noose if the prosecution gives them this precious certificate. We eventually learned from later court proceedings that cooperation itself is actually not enough. The information provided must actually be useful to and used by the law enforcement authorities to disrupt drug trafficking. Under this system, whether one is worthy of life depends on one's usefulness to the war on drugs. A system of oppression is a system that subordinates people's lives to the priorities of the powerful. Then we have Dakshinamurti Kataya, who was convicted of trafficking almost 45 grams of heroin across the border from Malaysia to Singapore. He was nearly killed last April when the prison authorities issued him with an execution notice, even though he had an ongoing civil suit. The civil suit has to do with the Singapore Prison Service copying the private correspondence of death row prisoners, including correspondence with lawyers, and forwarding it to the Attorney General's chambers, who also serve as the state prosecution. The state's position was that such a civil claim would not affect the China's death sentence and therefore should not be an impediment to hanging him. We're very lucky that the courts disagree and the China is still alive today. And he wrote from prison in May last year, "What allows me to be alive today? Is it the words from the judge, the law, my family, me, or God? If man has power under the law to exercise mercy, then who is deserving of it? I don't see anyone from death row that has received a presidential pardon. Why? What do death row inmates need to earn to be alive, to live their lives?" We are glad that the China and Panir, both of whom were only temporarily saved by 11th hour stays of execution, we're glad that they're still with us today. But many others have already been lost in this war on drugs. Around 500 people have been executed in Singapore since 1990, the majority of them for drug offenses. Just last year, my country hanged 11 men, all for drug trafficking. Among them was Kawan Singh from the Cameron Highlands in Malaysia. This was the very last letter he wrote to his niece Calvina, who he had raised as a child even when he was just a teenager himself. He refers to Calvina as baby girl. In this letter, he says, "My baby, whenever you miss me, you feel sad, lonely, or depressed, then you read this letter and also pray like we did when your mama can't control herself. I know that we have not created many good memories outside, as you were just 12 when I left you. But we do have good memories, and even the last few days of our last visit, baby girl. You are so beautiful inside and out that Ash must be very lucky to have you. The way you laugh, oh my God, my baby girl, I can see it for my whole life if allowed. Keep on staying happy after this, as you deserve it. You must move on and make me proud, and I know you can do it. I have faith in you, as you have proven before. Don't let whatever happened to me affect your life and studies. I will be watching over you, and even now pray to God to protect you forever." After he wrote this letter, Kawan Singh was hanged on 7th July 2022. Many of you might be familiar with the name of Nagendran K. Dharmalingam. His case has received a lot of international attention, and many activists and organizations, many of whom have come to attend this conference, spoke up for him and asked the Singapore government to show mercy. Despite this, Nagin was hanged on 27th April 2022. Today, his family and Ipoh are holding a prayer ceremony to mark the first anniversary of his death. And this is a letter that he wrote before execution with some help from the China, because Nagin couldn't really read or write English. "I'm thanking you from the bottom of my heart for all your support, effort, and prayers. My heart was shattered to see you shed tears for a person unworthy and undeserving like me. What more can I expect? To me, this is proof that God really exists. He sent such good and kind people in my life to show mercy and have compassion. I have seen and heard so many things in my darkest day in prison on death row, but nothing changed for good. One failure after another. The little that I have is gone now. Day after day, month after month has gone, and it became years. What else can I hope for? I'm totally exhausted. I'm a person that's been labeled as condemned and not in the least receiving any mercy or pardon. I don't have any hate or complaints. I don't blame or get angry with anyone. They're my mistakes. Though I do have many regrets, I accept everything as it comes. In fact, I'm very happy that at least God created me with one little heart in me, where I can say thanks from deep in my heart. I'm very grateful and appreciative for all your support. At least I can still express my gratitude to you through my words, writing, prayers, and tears as well. I'm wishing you happiness, joy, peace, and success in life. May the God that created you and me bless you and your family more and more. Grant you all your prayers and heart's desires. Peace be upon you. And so Nagin was hanged in prison. These are the voices of some of the men that Singapore insists are unworthy of life. They represent the voices of many more, past, present, and most horrifically future, who will be sacrificed to a never-ending war on drugs in Singapore. This war is a system of oppression that has disproportionately harmed the marginalized and the underprivileged, and it silences them, even as it does so. Today, I've read excerpts from the letters of death row prisoners as a challenge to this system, because the more death penalty retentionist states want to dehumanize people, the more we must hold on to our shared humanity. I just described the war on drugs as never-ending. That's definitely how it felt last year, when we saw execution notice after execution notice, when the tears had not yet dried for one death before we were told to expect another. But the war on drugs must end, and I believe it will, even in Singapore. I believe this when I saw 400 Singaporeans turn up in the only park in the country we are allowed to legally protest in, to stand against the death penalty. And one of the performers at the protest yelled, "Fuck the death penalty," and I heard hundreds of Singaporeans echo him. And protest chanting against capital punishment and using strong language, I cannot emphasize enough what an un-Singaporean sight that was. But perhaps, hopefully it will not be considered un-Singaporean any longer. At that moment in that park, I believe that Singapore's war on drugs would end. And I also believe this when I see the international trend away from the death penalty, when I see everybody here and all the wonderful work that you're doing, and also when I see developments that happen close by, like the abolition of the mandatory death penalty in Malaysia that's just next door to us. I especially believe this when my government doubles down on its rhetoric in defense of the death penalty for drugs, when the police call activists like us up for investigations and warnings related to our activist work. And in fact, today, one of my colleagues from the Transformative Justice Collective will be reporting to the police station for questioning. And when the Law and Home Affairs Minister takes to Facebook to make passive-aggressive comments about us, calling us narco-liberals, they wouldn't be so sensitive, so prickly, and so desperate if the war on drugs wasn't going to end. A movement is building in Singapore, a movement of Singaporeans, families of death row prisoners, and the prisoners themselves. To borrow Nagin's words, we were all born with one little heart in each of us. And with those hearts, we will continue to fight for a future that treats everyone as worthy and deserving. A future that recognizes that nobody is disposable, and a future where no one is left behind. And so I will end today's speech by repeating what 400 Singaporeans shouted in protest a year ago. We didn't just shout, "Fuck the death penalty." We also shouted, "End oppression, not life." Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much, Kirsten. That was such an amazing presentation, and I think you'll agree there are very few more powerful examples of the operation of systems of oppression than the death penalty and people on death row for drug offences. So I want to thank you for such a moving and powerful presentation and for sharing, as you say, the human face of those on death row and to remind us of the need to fight for their rights every day. So thank you so very much. Thanks. The next speaker we have is Gina Jackson. Gina has a Masters of Social Work. She is a Western Shoshone and Oglala Lakota. She is the co-CEO of the Return to the Heart Foundation that she co-founded in 2020. Gina's philanthropic experience includes Native Americans in philanthropy, Casey Foundation serving as an IPA at the Assistant Secretary's Office of the Interior before joining the Obama White House Community Solutions team during the last year of the administration. She has more than 20 years' experience encompassing state tribal justice, judicial education, collaboration, policy, and philanthropy. She is a connector, igniter, innovator, and equity builder with a vision to bring healing for our nation and beyond. Thanks, Gina.
I first want to acknowledge the Burung and the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation whose land we are upon right now. I know we've heard that, in the last sessions, and one of the greatest things was hearing it upon landing on the United Airlines. I was like, wow, that's so wonderful. The question that I always think of is, what else? Okay, that's a start, but what else? If we are doing more than acknowledging, if we're actually listening, if we actually listened to the Aboriginal and Indigenous people of the world, we would not be in this climate crisis at this point. And so it's time for us to start listening. Hagani, Nia Nara Binya. My name is Gina Jackson. I am Western Shoshone and Ogallala Lakota. Shoshone on my mother's side, my father's side, Ogallala on my grandfather's side from South Dakota. I live in northern Nevada, which is about 7 hours drive north of Las Vegas. And most people know where Las Vegas is. They kind of have an idea. I am here before you, strong and resilient, carrying within my veins the blood of warriors, the DNA of healers, the love for our ancestors, and the love for the young ones today. I am here despite attempts to wipe out my people. I carry within me the light and fire, ancestral wisdom, solutions, and healing for my people and beyond. I am the answer to my ancestors' prayers. I'm here to be a Native Indigenous voice, not just on a professional level, but on a personal level as well. I was 11 years old when my aunt was having a wasipi, a sweat lodge ceremony at her house in Reno, on the reservation, which was once on the outside of town, but the city grew around it. It was a piece of land where the dumps was, like the old dumps. And they decided, we'll just let the Native people have that. And that became very valuable now because it's like in the center of town. The ceremony was going on into the night, and afterwards we would have a feast. And so the people who didn't go in, some kids and maybe some others, we were waiting to eat after midnight. And so I was one of those kids with my two cousins who were 9 years old and 7 years old, so little kids, right? It was a warm summer night, and I thought it would be a good idea to climb over the neighbor's fence. And then behind their neighbor, another fence, were some cute boys who lived there. I just wanted to say hi. So my little cousins follow me. We hop the fence and we hop another fence and knock on the window and say our little awkward hellos. And as we were leaving, the police rolled up and came into the backyard, shined their lights on us. They yelled at us to put our hands in the air. They held guns on us and walked us out to the front street. And my littlest cousin, the 7-year-old, she was just bawling, just crying so hard. We were afraid to comfort her, afraid to do anything because the guns were still on us. As they put us in the back of the police car, one of the officers was putting us in, the other officer was standing there with guns on us. And I told him, I said, put your guns down. We're not criminals, we're kids. And he paused for a second. He must have been in his 20s, or I would say early 20s. He didn't put his gun down, not until we were already in the car. Flash forward 20 years. So I'm at the same tribal reservation. Now I work there. I have a master's degree in social work, and I'm in social services department. And my office window faces the street, which is the street that goes behind a bunch of residences' backyards. So in a meeting and with my boss, and a bunch of police cars drive by, just really fast, and their sirens are on. So we're like, oh, wow, what's going on? So just a couple minutes later, more police. They brought the city police in. So now we have 2 different jurisdictions of police. Actually, they brought in Sparks. So we have 2 cities and 1 tribal types of police. And they're all zooming by and then coming back this way. So out the window, I see a young Native man, who is probably early 20s, and he's jumping fences. He jumps over one fence to get into the next residential backyard and jumps another fence, and he's jumping fences till he gets to the end corner. And I see that he has a knife in his hand. The police surround him, and there's a lot of police. I don't know, 12 cars. I mean, there's a lot of police. And they surround him in this backyard. The backyard's open, so I can see the whole backyard. And I can see that, they're yelling at him to stand down, drop your weapons, and he's just standing there, like, just looking around. And finally, he takes one step. And as he takes that one step, an officer shoots him. As he shoots him, just for a split second, I see his spirit leave his body. Now, I know that might be like, what is she talking about? I'm just telling you. I seen his spirit leave his body. I knew that was it. There was no bringing him back at that point. He falls onto the ground, and everybody's just like, so like, what did we just see? We just saw somebody get killed. And later, I kept asking questions like, why did they just shoot him to kill him? Couldn't they shoot him in the leg? And then I was told, nope, officer's training is you shoot to kill. It's not, you don't shoot to wound. It's like, okay, why didn't they use taser? Why didn't they use a taser just to get him down? Oh, we don't have tasers. What do you mean you don't have tasers? Oh yeah, we don't have the money to buy a taser, so no. So being in my 20s around that time and seeing that, actually it's probably 30, it was just so devastating, life-changing really, to see a murder like that and to know that it did not have to happen. Flash forward another 20 years, my brother moves out of state to go to treatment for methamphetamines with his 2 small children. He stays, it's in Oregon, he stays in Oregon. We didn't have the services, we still don't. In fact, treatment centers are closing down, they're not expanding, services are getting worse. So he moves out of state, his path has been one that has ebbed and flowed. He does great, and then not so great, and then really bad. This last time was really, really bad. Child services took my niece and nephew. I was able to, they called me. I had a protection that I did. In the US, there was a law that was passed called the Indian Child Welfare Act. And this law gave rights to family and also to tribes to intervene. And so I had my brother sign Indian legal custodianship document. I found it on California Legal Service. I just downloaded it and we printed it and signed it. And I showed up with that document, and they immediately gave me my niece and nephew. But that law is being, targeted. Right now it's been heard before the Supreme Court, and it may go down. We may lose those protections. But that's my personal level, the day-to-day of raising an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old who, have been through so much. And, for me, it's not just, what I do in my work, but it's really been a whole lifelong journey about why. Why are we in the situation that we're in today? Why are we being targeted? So many times you hear Indigenous people being called vulnerable populations. We're not vulnerable, we were targeted for our land and resources. We are still being targeted. There's an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We are being targeted because the laws are not protecting us. You know, in the US, we're under 2 jurisdictions, and it's federal, tribal, and depending on where it happened, it could be the city or state. Because of those different jurisdictions, everything falls through the cracks. If a high crime happens on the reservation, then they pass it over to the feds. Federal prosecution rate is 51%. Not winning, just prosecution. So you commit a murder, 51% of the chance we might prosecute. Not saying that they're gonna win or lose, but we might do it. So people are slipping through the cracks. And you know, hearing last night, and I just loved that it's just the truth-telling coming out, is those are racist policies and practices and laws, and we have to change those. So here, today, right now, every day, it's so critical that we're addressing harm reduction. Lives are on the line. My brother's life has been on the line. I'm so grateful that he's safe and he's starting to do better, doing well. My niece and nephew are starting to thrive. But the roots really are coming from genocide, racial injustice, and inequity. And we are still reeling from it every single day. I learned early on the impact of Native boarding schools on my family. All of my grandparents were forced from their families. All of them were placed in residential schools. They didn't go by age because back then you may not have had a birth certificate. They went on height. Oh, you're this tall, you're going. You could be a tall 5-year-old. The abuses that they experienced, neglect, hunger, deprivation of kindness and love, being punished for speaking their language, was so effective that they didn't, all of my grandparents, did not teach their children to be fluent in their language. So whole generation, my parents, aunts and uncles, whole generation are not fluent speakers. So how are they gonna teach us, the kids? Not very well. So living those effects every single day, you know, identity and purpose is everything, and that's where our healing begins. We could wait no longer, not even for one more second, to stand up and do something about it. Working in the philanthropic sector as a Native woman, learned some lessons. One of them is that the whole sector itself is based on wealth that many times was accumulated on the backs of the people, of the land, the water, and its resources. And so being able to be in that sector and to teach, you know, colleagues, it was great. You know, there's a lot of work to be done. We're just at the very beginning. But also experienced that it is a very male-dominated sector, and mostly white male. But if you drill down, even within the Native, you know, cohorts of philanthropy, still male-dominated. And so we know, like statistically, philanthropy underfunds Native people. So when we are 3% of the population, we get funded less than 0.5%, just in general, statistically. But when you take that less than 0.5%, so it's like 0.4 something, and ask what goes to women and girls, way less, way less. So we had to do something. And so just kind of dreaming with amazing people. That's why I'm so happy to be here, because I'm already starting to have these conversations with folks who I met just last night. Like, what could we do? And that's what we did. We started dreaming, what could we do? We are at a place where we've been left out, you know, their needs are great. And just having dinner and a movie night with a colleague of mine, Sarah Eaglehart, she's also a co-founder. She just put out a book called Warrior Princess Strike Back. It's a self-help book with her twin sister, who's a psychotherapist, so it's good reading if you have a chance. And then back then it was Representative Red Dawn Foster, who is now State Senator Red Dawn Foster. We just started dreaming, and we thought, what if we created a foundation? It's like, well, we don't have any money. We don't have an endowment. We don't have anything. but we did believe that we could do it. And so Sarah had to work for like 8 months for free until we could, gain some momentum and build our programming. And we actually did. Our first year we were launched. It actually was the same month that COVID was declared as a global pandemic. All of our efforts went into PPE and trying to, get resources to tribes because, of course, same story, right? It's nothing new. So the U.S. put out funding to states. They left out tribes. Oh, okay, next round. We'll get you the next round. They put out funding to states, and they included tribes, but they didn't get the money out. They just included us in words, but not actions. Okay, so in the meantime, everybody, communities are hit so hard. People are dying. It was horrible. But we were able to jump in and do some good work and, really put out a lot of funding into Native communities. But as we are looking to empower and resource, and by resource I mean give money, give funding to Native women who are bringing healing to their communities and beyond, we're really looking to cultivate a world where Indigenous women and girls are valued. Okay, maybe the world's not valuing us. We value you. Where they're protected, where we're no longer looking at everybody falling through the cracks, and where they're supported so that we're in a place where Mother Earth can thrive for future generations. We are people of the land, people of place. And when we heal the earth, we're healing ourselves. You guys probably know this, but the United Nations Girls Initiative has done, given us lots of data, but one point is when an educated woman's income increases, she will invest 90% of that income back into her family, into her community. And this is the bottom line is when you educate a woman, you can expect economic growth. So what is our foundation doing? We are investing in women. We are not just doing grant making for traditional helpers and healers. We are doing fellowships where we're supporting Native women entrepreneurs who are looking to build their businesses and regenerate their economies and their communities. We are looking at supporting Native girls and pairing them with climate justice warriors so they can find their voices and open up places and spaces where they can be heard. Because the crisis we're in, we cannot be left out. All of these new and exciting ideas, they're not new and exciting ideas. You have to go back to the ideas from the traditional beliefs and values and practices of the people of the land, the caretakers of the land, who really have a deep understanding and respect of how to treat our world. And as we are doing this, we are challenging systems of oppression. And it's so important for us to be intentional and to change the language that we're using. So long the blame of ills and devastating statistics have been put on Native people as a way of, diminishing us. If we are even in the data. If we're not in the data, it's because, your population is statistically insignificant. That's erasure, and it perpetuates a genocide in itself. We were 100% prior to contact. Okay, 3% now, but we were 100%. If you're gonna leave us out, tell why. Put a paragraph, due to the genocide of the indigenous people of this land, we are not including them. When there is data, it's often through the deficit lens. And so, for example, Native girls have the highest incarceration rate of any demographic in the US, ages 10 to 17. Who knew, right? Where are these Native girls? Where are they? And how are they incarcerated? Well, one thing is back to that jurisdictional, federal versus tribal and state, right? And when kids get into federal systems, often they stay there for long, long periods of time. Other things, poor graduation rate, high suicide rates, high rates of poverty, high rates of sexual assault. You know, people cite those statistics, but where's the solutions? We're doing our own research now as a foundation. My co-CEO is a doctoral candidate. She will have her degree in 2 months. Joni Swina from the Pueblo Cochiti in New Mexico. And we are conducting our own research, looking at an asset-based lens, looking at those protective factors, connection to community, culture, language, spirituality, the things that will build that resilience in our young people today. And it has to be this way. You know, we've waited. I've waited my whole life. Who is going to come and save us? Nobody's coming to save us. We have to do it ourselves. And so our decolonized data and research agenda is by us, for us. And it's such an honor, you know, being with you here today, because my voice may not be a voice you've heard much. And so as we are challenging those systems, we're looking at not just the front lines, and I'm so grateful for all of the frontline workers, the people who are working with folks every single day, and the mid-level folks who are running organizations, and national voices as well. Another appreciation is for the folks who break their way into legislative bodies and policymakers, lawmakers. Where I'm from, in Nevada, Nuwa Sogavia, is our ancestral lands start from Idaho, going all the way through Nevada, even down to LA. And currently, and I didn't know this until last year when my niece did a science project on like minerals and rocks, that we're in Nevada are in our biggest gold rush in history. We are in Nevada, one of the 4th highest gold producing places in the world, with 83% of gold mining mined in Nuwa Sogavia, unceded land. Nobody talks about that. We receive no royalties. In fact, Nevada doesn't even have a state income tax. And that's why everybody comes to all the great big businesses, because we don't tax them. So exploitation is happening today and every day. On my Lakota side, our most sacred lands are the Black Hills. My great-great-grandfather was at the Fort Laramie Treaty. If you look at the treaty map, it's huge. When you look at what's left, it's about that much. It's very, very tiny. The treaties, this treaty, none of the treaties were ever honored. And so who has this land? The government has some of it, squatters, people who just set up shop. There's lots of towns in the area, homesteaders who just moved in. So one of the big movements is land back, and that is Native people, Native tribes, Native organizations are buying back their land. And one of the things that we have a vision for is a healing retreat center. We go back to the Black Hills, and we have an event, summer solstice, and we have to rent space from, the people, from hotels and from, businesses. We pay money to the colonizers and the people who stole our land so we could have a meeting. And we don't want to do that anymore. We want to have our own space. We'll charge them to come and have space where we are. So, we're just building out that capital campaign now, and every time we see another tribe get land back, it's so exciting, because how valuable and important can that be, that one little piece of stewardship? What's making a difference? Really, that's a question I've asked myself my whole life. My whole life I've asked, what can I do to make the biggest difference? And right now, really getting those lawmakers in office and supporting those women who have a vision to, close those gaps and get rid of those racist laws, and to be able to do things in a way that is more supportive and more equitable, is where we're seeing a lot of a lot of progress. We had our first Native woman congresswoman just a few years back, Deb Haaland, come into office. Immediately, she was nominated to be the first Native woman cabinet secretary of the Department of Interior, which used to be the War Department that would like deal with tribes. And now she is in that position, which I think it might, I'm not sure of the number, but it might be like 4th position down from the president, like, you know, that chain there. But good things are happening. Investigations of our residential schools are just starting to begin. You know, in Canada, it's so heartbreaking to see those numbers of the bodies that are being found of children buried in unmarked graves with the ground penetrating radar. You know, that's gonna be what we're gonna be dealing with too, very soon. Missing and murdered and Indigenous women is another issue that she's focused on. But without having her voice in the federal government, you know, would anybody else be standing up for us? Would anybody else be doing this? She is working on partnerships to give federal land co-stewardship, so like national parks back to tribal communities. There's 60 agreements right now that are being worked on for 60 different land agreements to give that stewardship back to tribes. So as you learn more about the Indigenous people and the land where you reside, learn how people are being affected and impacted today. Because it's not the past, right? In the US, we have a really short history. Oh, that was a long time ago. That doesn't apply today. No, it applies today and every day. Be intentional to include Indigenous people in all of your work. Self-reflect, data inclusion. It takes deeper healing to have, takes deeper learning to have deeper healing. And we need allies that are willing to take a journey coming with us in cultural humility, not savior vibes, who can bring open hearts, open minds, strategic thinking, complex problem solving, and teamwork. Our stories are powerful. The medicine that these women carry is powerful. Pass them the mic.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was such a brilliant presentation, Gina, and thank you for sharing some of your personal journey with us. It's a true privilege, and reminding us that First Nations people are not vulnerable. This is about communities who are targeted and exploited, and it's about genocide, and it must change, and the racist laws and policies must end, and that must include support and empowerment for Indigenous women and girls. So thank you for sharing that with us. So my next speaker is Kassandra Frederique, and I believe that happy birthday is in order. Both for yesterday and today. So yesterday here and today in the US, where Kassandra is from. But also Kassandra has a slightly longer bio, and I do really want to read this because it's extraordinary, and I think because it's her birthday, I think I can do this for her. Okay, so Kassandra Frederique is the Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance, a national non-profit that works to end the war on drugs, which has disproportionately harmed Black, Latinx, Indigenous, immigrant, and LGBTQ communities, and build alternatives grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. During her time at DPA, Kassandra has built and led innovative campaigns around policing, the overdose crisis, and marijuana legislation, each with a consistent racial justice focus. Her advocacy and all of the Drug Policy Alliance's work lies at the intersection of health, equity, autonomy, and justice. She has mobilised cities to rethink their approach to drug policy from the ground up and has helped to bring dialogue around safer consumption sites to the national level through strategic organising and partner development. Among other victories, Kassandra was the architect of the campaign that cut the number of New York City marijuana arrests by more than 99% in 2010. Amazing. Curtailing the city's infamous reign as the marijuana arrest capital of the country. Through her work, Kassandra has been a powerful advocate for working closely with people who have been directly impacted by the war on drugs, and she has built strong alliances with partners in New York and beyond. She has been instrumental in grounding the national drug policy conversation around reparative justice and restitution for communities harmed by the war on drugs. Additionally, she is actively working with the In Our Names network and other efforts across the country to resist drug war-fueled state violence. She has been featured in the New York Times, NBC, US Today, National Public Radio, and the Netflix documentary Grass is Greener. She has received numerous awards, including the Activist Award from the SEIU 32BJ, New York City Council Women of Distinction, Vocal New York's Joe Bostic Advocacy Award, National Advocates for Pregnant Women Emerging Leader Award, and was recognised on both Essence Magazine Woke 100 and the Root 100. A New Yorker, Kassandra holds a Master's in Social Work from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Labour Relations at Cornell University. Please make her welcome.
First, I will apologize because obviously I just sent the link from the DPA website and probably did not pay attention to the instructions of a shorter bio, so sorry. Okay, I'll start my timer. I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We are a global movement committed to ending the drug war. People use drugs, people trade drugs. We see the role that drugs have played in masking trauma and pain, the role drugs play in making people brave enough to face life every day, the role drugs play in making people happy and experience joy. And we know that it is drug laws, not the drugs themselves, that have built a massive system of oppression. Our drug laws have perverted systems of health, schools, employment, childbirth, agriculture, climate, public safety, and democracy, to name a few. Drug laws influence our daily basic life, and yet decision makers around the world would want us to believe that it is drugs and drugs alone that make our lives difficult. Not the international treaties, the corruption, the toxic drug supply created by prohibition, immigration, or criminal punishment systems. Yes, I know. We must decriminalize drug possession, sales, and regulate the drug supply. And as a Black person from the global North, where class and race are determining factors on whether I live or die walking down the street, live or die giving birth in hospitals, live or die expressing my right to exist. It is not enough to decriminalize drugs and regulate the drug supply. We need to decriminalize our communities and build our power so we don't need laws to validate our existence. Perhaps the most sobering thing about this movement is how much we focus on changing the drug laws and how much many of us realize that if we were not in this room for drugs, we'd be here for something else. Sobering is the idea that while drug possession is one of the leading causes of incarceration for women across the world, the top arrest in the US, and in 35 countries, an excuse for killing people we find unworthy, that in another country, there is this many people in a room discussing a different issue that impacts a similar population of people. It is incredibly sobering to think that our collective goals to decriminalize drug possession and the regulation of all drugs, while noble and necessary, lack the innate power to transform society on their own. Because as incredibly difficult as it is to dismantle the drug war, that in and of itself is not enough to dismantle in its entirety the impacts of imperialism, colonization, capitalism, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, racism, and many other oppressive systems that entangle themselves in our society. So why do it? Why do it if it is not enough to end oppression? Because if drugs are our government's excuse to create laws, to limit our freedoms, disrupt our communities, and kill our loved ones, then drug laws are our movement's reason to establish our right to live and love, build systems that work for everyone, and birth new people to experience joy and promise. It is not lost on me that I am an American and that I operate with an incredible amount of privilege in this space. The Drug Policy Alliance is one of the largest, if not the largest, drug policy organization in the world. We are well-resourced in comparison to the organizations represented in this room. And while incredibly proud of the work that my colleagues and I have done in the US, fighting back against the systems of oppression that work to kill our loved ones, we are woefully inadequate when it comes to dismantling the systems of oppression that the US funds, encourages, and orchestrates outside of our country. The US exports its systems of oppression out to international bodies like the UN and to nation states in Latin America and the Southeast Asia. Over the last year, as I've started to travel to meet with drug policy reformers around the world, it has been impressed upon me by many, including some of you in this room, how we will be unable to reach our collective goals of ending global systems of oppression if American reformers in drugs and other issues do not take responsibility for fighting against what our government is doing to other nation states. But most surprisingly for me, as an American drug policy reformer, is that our drug policy reforms will also be exported, and that is not always a good thing, especially if our reforms do not take into consideration the potential impacts in other global contexts. Our US movement policy concessions run the risk of becoming global movement policy concessions, or can inadvertently lock in the reform perimeters that you all must work against. Nowhere is that more prevalent than in the US cannabis reform, where concessions around distribution that have created incredibly high barriers for entry and have consolidated the market, which now have US and Canadian companies writing regulatory policies in the US and traveling around the world, selling their policies to governments, all while US drug policy reformers struggle to meet the moment to build global solidarity by building a federal cannabis reform policy that takes global markets into account. There has never been a question for me and my colleagues in the US, there has never been a question for me and my colleagues that the US drug policy is a system of oppression. But what we are learning in real time is that the body of laws and reforms that we are fighting for and winning can generate a system of oppression too, within and outside of our borders. and that we hold an incredible global responsibility. We're learning that the way forward includes decentering ourselves and our US voices, and building US domestic strategy by creating global solidarity, by taking direction and input from our global allies. This is a lesson we are learning, and it is taking us time to learn and to see the tentacles of US imperialism. And while you do not owe us patience, after decades of US-generated violence against your countries, I ask for grace. As a first-generation Black American woman who's still working to remove the US tentacles from my very own neck, as I direct an organization whose work has incredible impact on all of you. It is through that lens that I humbly put forward two offerings to us as a global movement. We know that the criminal punishment system is a system of oppression, and so are some of our nation states. But I want to offer that our global health system worsens inequities and is also a system of oppression. According to the World Health Organization, the social determinants of health are conditions in which people are born, grow, work, live, and age, and people's access to power, money, and resources. The social determinants are the major drivers of health inequities, unfair, avoidable, and remediable differences in health between social groups. Inequalities in the social determinants of health have been unmasked by the COVID-19 pandemic and have led to glaring inequities in COVID-19 health outcomes between population groups. But y'all, I'd offer that inequalities in social determinants of health have long been unmasked by people who use drugs. People who use drugs have been navigating broken health systems across the world. And while there have been significant and meaningful advancements in the health, well-being, and dignity of drug users through health and public health systems, I'd venture to declare that we all know that the system as it is inadequate. I know that it is taboo to say to the international harm reduction movement, we are all collectively putting a lot of stock into the health system and public health as a discipline. But people who use drugs have told us for decades that the healthcare system is not neutral or a benevolent system. We are faced with an age-old social change question. Do we fix it or do we create something new? I will not pretend to know the answer. But I will say that if we want to end systems of oppression, we must interrogate and demand more from the partnerships we are making with the public health field and the healthcare systems. The demand is that they have less power and we have more. Public health and healthcare systems have already shown that they are not impervious to stigmatizing and discriminating against our community. We know this because public health research reinforces a hierarchy of drugs, which leaves stimulant users out in the cold, fending for themselves. We also know that governments will violate rights of individuals in the furtherance of public health by forcing people into coercive treatment facilities, sterilizing birthing people around the world, and continuing to uphold a system of prohibition that has poisoned our drug supply, creating new challenges that have left us with little resources to tend to the tsunami of death that these policies have unleashed. Some healthcare systems are complicit and are not accomplices in dismantling the war on drugs, and at times leverage their neutral veneer to amass power for themselves at the expense of people who use drugs. This brings me to what I want to impress upon us today. Our reforms cannot create new or strengthen existing systems of oppression. Again, I know I speak from a US perspective, and what I'm offering may not be immediately applicable to you, and I welcome it to be interrogated. Our collective reforms must lessen the power of systems that govern our communities. Decriminalization reforms cannot be predicated on the discretion of law enforcement. Tickets are not reforms. Our reforms must give law enforcement less tools, not new or additional tools. Law enforcement's role in the drug war has led to massive physical and sexual violence, death, and divestment from our social welfare infrastructure. Decriminalization also cannot be predicated on the insistence of drug treatment. If people want to go to treatment, they should be able to go to treatment on their own. Forcing or mandating people to go to treatment is the drug war too. We need to share that unapologetically with our communities. Do not, I repeat, do not repeat our mistakes from the global north. Make it clear as you are pushing for your reforms now. Treatment instead of incarceration should not be our movement's slogan. Partly because most interventions that are billed as treatment don't work, and interventions that strip the agency and dignity of people who use drugs should be our movement's primer marker of whether that is a reform we want to support. If people are struggling with drug use, it is probably because of the same reasons it made people susceptible to COVID-19: poverty and deprivation, lack of social protection, unequal legal or residential status, stigmatization, unequal access to acceptable public health information, or inequitable access to affordable treatment and prevention. The people who are most susceptible to the drug war are also the people who are most susceptible to COVID-19 mortality and morbidity. Poorer people, marginalized ethnic minorities, including indigenous peoples, migrants, populations affected by emergencies, including conflicts, incarcerated populations, homeless people. These are also the same people that are most impacted by climate, food insecurity, HIV/AIDS, and countless other issues. Remember that I said earlier that there are other rooms where we are talking about the same people. In order to dismantle systems of oppression of the drug war, we need to be in a bigger room. We need to be in more rooms. Building across movement campaigns and strategies that build collective power for people. Because the powers of the world are in one room, writing policies and funding wars that consolidate their power against us and our loved ones. I've been reminded by an Indigenous colleague that I come from a country that teaches social change is something that should happen in my lifetime, and how incredibly naive that is. And yet it seems incredibly irresponsible to not thrive for that. Our people are dying. The powers that are creating the conditions that are making it more and more difficult to live in a joyous world. And at some point, I want to stop fighting and experience justice and repair. I don't think that that is too much to ask for any of us. However, my colleague pushed me to realize that I need to stop fighting campaigns for justice, that I need to build movements for power so that I can contribute to a tradition of justice for the future. There are probably many pathways to get there, but these are the questions I ask myself daily to interrogate my work, the work of Drug Policy Alliance, and what I offer you today for our collective work. Do those reforms make those systems have less power? Are our community members safer? Are their rights protected? Do we have the power? I am grateful that I was offered the opportunity to share with you all this morning. I look forward to leveraging my power and giving up my power to be in community with all of you, so that we may strengthen the power of our movement to contribute to a tradition of justice that is sweet for all of us. Thank you.
Wow, that was just bloody brilliant, wasn't it? Thank you so much. And thank you for reminding us that we don't just need to decriminalise our drug laws, we need to decriminalise our communities, agree, so we don't need laws to validate our lives. Very, very good point. And reminding us that we need to be highly vigilant when it comes to the detail of drug policy reform, and not to create new or strengthen current systems of oppression through the work that we are all doing, and that includes global health systems in that. So thank you, Kassandra. That was a timely reminder for everyone in the work we all strive to do. Now, we did start a few minutes late, and I'm going to hopefully ask you all to stay with us a few minutes longer for this session, because we do have one final speaker, and I would like to invite Dr. Gideon Lasco, MD, PhD, to the stage. Thank you, Gideon, for being with us. So Gideon has been a little unwell, so hopefully you'll all treat him very kindly, but he has made the effort to come and speak to us here this morning, and we're very glad for it. He is a physician, a medical anthropologist and drug policy scholar based in Manila in the Philippines. He's a senior lecturer at the University of the Philippines Diliman's Department of Anthropology, and a research fellow at the Hong Kong University Centre for Criminology. Since 2011, he has been doing ethnographic and qualitative research on drug issues in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and has used his research and writing to critique and challenge the drug wars in his country and region. He is the editor of Drugs and the Philippine Society, Ateneo de Manila, University Press, 2021, an edited volume which features critical perspectives on drug use and drug policy in the country, an author of the Asia chapter of the 2020 and 2022 editions of the Global State of Harm Reduction. For his research on the politics of drugs and drug wars in Asia, he received the inaugural ISSDP Research Excellence Award in 2022. Please welcome Gideon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. As I stand before you today, I want to emulate my colleagues in paying my respects to the elders, the owners of this land. As an anthropologist, I'm very much inspired by this custom of acknowledgement because it directs us to history and makes visible the structural violence of colonialism that endures and with which drug policy intersects. I also want to thank the HRI team and everyone else who's behind this conference. Thank you for gathering us to community. 10 years ago, I was hanging out with some young people in my country, the Philippines, to understand what chemicals they use in their everyday lives. They mentioned cigarettes, alcohol, skin whitening creams, energy drinks. But as I gained their trust, they opened up to me about the roles of methamphetamine, locally known as shabu. It's our vitamin, they told me, citing the need to stay awake, have energy, gain confidence in a very difficult economic environment where performance meant survival. Those young people taught me to question the forced categorizations of drug use as legal or illegal, medical or recreational, occupational or functional, and so on. Like so many concepts that surround the hegemonic drug policy discourse, those labels were meaningless but harmful. As for the young people I met, far from the image of the dangerous addicts I grew up fearing, they were first and foremost young people. After that research, I moved to other topics, but when Rodrigo Duterte initiated his drug war in 2016, I felt I had a moral responsibility to return to my research. I thought of the young people I hung out with and was chilled by the possibility that they could be among those who have been killed. But it was not just the killings that disturbed me. It was a whole-of-society approach to drugs that typecasts people as addicts and criminals that see punishment or treatment as the two only valid responses to drug use. And as we know, there's very little difference between the two. We may single out Duterte, but his views are actually shared by many politicians, and his policies are best seen not as exceptions, but as culminations of over a century of increasingly punitive laws. Today, almost a year after Duterte left office, the work of harm reduction continues. That dark and painful phase cannot be dismissed as over because the same punitive laws continue to be enforced. The drug war and the politicians who endorse it remain popular. And while not in the magnitude of 2016 or 2017, there continue to be reports of drug-related killings. In any case, the past 6 years, the past very painful years, offers us lessons to decolonize not just drug policy, but harm reduction itself. The first is that politicians, especially in the Global South, can use ethno-nationalist, nativist, and even anti-colonial arguments to defend their policies and refute what they label as Western solutions. As such, rather than just seeing harm reduction as inherently decolonial, harm reduction itself needs to be decolonized. In fact, this cannot be highlighted enough. Harm reduction, broadly construed as a philosophy, has pre-colonial antecedents. People have always had intimacy with psychoactive substances, and the use of these substances can take place in various contexts, from the sacred to the social. By looking at indigenous traditions, values, and practices, not just as subject of respect, but as sources of wisdom, we can indigenize drug policy. Indeed, the work of decolonization must work at a fundamental level, not just in terms of programs, but paradigms. For instance, as the Indian anthropologist Wasti Mishra reminds me, even the idea of the individual, upon which many drug policies are based, deserve to be interrogated in light of very intersubjective contexts of drug use, both among indigenous and non-indigenous communities. In the case of the young people I mentioned, what is harming them is the intergenerational economic exclusion that leads them to use the language of both Achille Mbembe and Duterte have used, albeit for very different reasons, to be cast as living dead. In this vein, we also need to acknowledge that indigenous and local efforts to resist colonial drug policies are as old as colonialism itself and long precede our movements. In Bolivia, for instance, the punitive drug regime has long been viewed as a colonial imposition, owing in part to prohibitionist policies on the coca leaf that are in stark contrast with people's customs and experiences of prohibition. And in the Philippines, accounts of drug use before the American colonial period, for instance by the national hero Jose Rizal, have been recovered by historians to get people to think about the absurdity of today's drug paradigm, under which even the national hero can be considered an addict, an abuser, someone who deserves punishment. Moreover, we need to empower local actors who are piloting or trying to pilot harm reduction initiatives, because these are powerful, politically and pragmatically useful. Methamphetamine, for instance, is the main drug concern in the country, not just because it's the most common, but it's also the most vilified. But we still don't know much about harm reduction for amphetamines, although I'm really glad that in the past few years, there have been some initiatives that have emerged from Indonesia, for example, New Zealand, Vietnam, I believe, and many other places. We also need to empower local voices who boldly resist dominant narratives and bravely advocate for decriminalization and other initiatives at personal and professional risk. For understandable reasons, people who may not identify as people who use drugs in a country where such a label can get them jailed or killed. But those who work on drug issues locally have the discursive power to challenge politicians' narratives, and just as importantly, help shift the way society thinks about drugs and the people who use them. Politicians from Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and elsewhere in Asia openly voiced support for Duterte and vowed to copy his approach. Some did. And Duterte himself openly drew inspiration from Thailand, from Thaksin. But if there's such a thing as regional bad influence, there can also be regional good influence. And so it's so important to build regional alliances and to draw inspiration from each other. And so it entails moving beyond harm reduction as a set of practices or programs, but as a set of principles and paradigms, or even as a philosophy. Admittedly, there are challenges. We may have more representation now, but we are fragile. Our resources are very limited. Our allies are few. And yet, the Duterte years, while undoubtedly a setback for drug policy, and I want to mention not just the killings, I also want to highlight the other things that happened during that time. People, for example, even in one prison alone in the Philippines, over 5,000 die each year. 20% of the prison population, mostly from infectious diseases. That's why it really resonates to me that we have to decolonize public health itself. We have to challenge public health. Because imagine, 20% of the entire population in one prison alone effectively makes imprisonment a death sentence. Mega rehab centers characterized by compulsory detention. Drug testing. At one point, there was an initiative to test all the children in the Philippines for drugs. These are initiatives that thankfully never happened, and it's also things to push back from local activists. And they were even also proposing to lower the age of criminal responsibility from 15 to 12 and even 9 years old. So there are challenges, certainly. And even today, more than 6 years later, Senator Laila de Lima, a dear friend of mine, is still in jail. And so are many others in a country where the possession of just a few sticks of cannabis can mean several years behind bars. And yet, the Duterte years, while undoubtedly a setback for drug policy, was also a moment of pushback, during which we saw meaningful progress. We saw organizations taking place. We saw people starting to realize that their stances are problematic. Journalists are finally seeing the biases on their own reporting, and I'm sure many of you will resonate with the fact that we also need to engage with how journalism portrays people who use drugs. Academics are finally studying a topic that they have long ignored or have ceded to the over-medicalized discourse of addiction science. So we saw reasons to hope, given that there were recognitions to this. And far from being a monolith, the Philippine government has also shown openness to various approaches. Even with a government dominated by Duterte, a few brave lawmakers dared to file harm reduction bills. So harm reduction is in the language of the bills that the lawmakers have filed, even during those moments that we see so many killings taking place. And local governments have expressed much more openness than local ones. Our efforts have yet to bear fruit from all of these, but surely we have planted seeds. And so, this is the message that I want to send you from the Philippines. That even when our leaders suppress our rights and oppress our people, there are good people in government, in the private sector, civil society, people who use drugs, who work for change, pursuing activisms both loud and quiet, advocacies both urgent and enduring. That even when society as a whole think that drugs are evil, even when they support leaders who echo that view, there are academics, artists, advocates, activists, various allies who try in their own ways to erode that view, slowly and patiently, pointing out its many contradictions. And even at the darkest moments of oppression, there are pockets of resistance and are spelling the difference between death and life. And so in the spirit of courage, solidarity, and hope, I say to the government officials and policymakers who are in attendance today, give harm reduction a chance. And to everyone in this wonderful and vibrant community, let us keep up the good and important work towards ending the cruel fantasy of a drug-free world and reclaiming the agency, the dignity, and the humanity of people who use drugs. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon, for another really inspirational presentation, and I think for reminding us that we don't need to just decolonise drug policy, but decolonise harm reduction itself. And I think you make some very persuasive arguments on that case. And I know that Gideon has published on this in more detail recently, and I really commend that to you and I encourage you to seek that out. I've just lost my microphone down the back, so it's rather uncomfortable. Right, sorry about that. So we're going to finish up now, and thank you for staying for a few minutes longer. I think you will agree that it has been a few minutes worth spending. I think we've had the most amazing, incredible speakers this morning. They have opened our minds, they have filled our hearts. They have also challenged us, each and every one of us, I think, to think more deeply, to act more intentionally, and perhaps most importantly, to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. We in this room are the beginning of the end of the racist war on drugs. Recently, in a landmark Australian legal case, drug-related stigma was found to be a causal and contributing factor to the death in custody of an Aboriginal woman. This finding, in so many ways, makes me sick to my stomach, quite frankly, partly because of what it says about Veronica's suffering, but also because it is the first time that we've seen such a finding, despite so many black deaths in custody for people who were there for drug-related offences for so many, many decades. But strangely, it also gives me hope. I think where there is a commitment to truth-telling, real truth-telling, I think there is the potential for real change. And I think we need that level of truth-telling if we are going to address what I think is one of the most pressing social policy issues of our time, the racist war on people who use drugs. So there is indeed strength in solidarity. So let's make that count. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. And thank our speakers once more. Time for morning tea. Thank you.